is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now. Just moments ago, Britain came to a complete standstill. Outside Buckingham Palace, reporters gathered under a gray fall sky as the palace spokesperson walked up to the microphones with shaking hands. In carefully chosen words, they confirmed what millions had feared but refused to believe. King Charles had made a heartbreaking personal choice because of his getting worse health. As news anchors stopped their regular shows and crowds started gathering, one thing became clear. This wasn't just any royal announcement. This was history happening right now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The palace's announcement cut through everyday life like a sudden bell ringing. It wasn't just a simple announcement. It was the opening act of a moment that would mark an entire time period. Officials described the choice as deeply personal but necessary, a phrase that carried both seriousness and sadness. For weeks, rumors about the king's health had been going around. But now, the monarchy itself confirmed what insiders had only dared to whisper quietly. This was a major turning point, one carefully presented as a moment of change for the crown. But the truth underneath was far heavier. Behind the palace's carefully written statement was a sense of urgency and something that couldn't be avoided that even the most loyal royal watchers could feel deep down. William's quiet but firm approval of the final words moments before it was released was telling. He wasn't just watching his father's choice. He was already shaping the story. As the statement played through television screens and phones across the world, every word had been carefully considered. Every phrase looked at closely, and every line designed to calm a nation getting ready for change. Yet even with that careful planning, the effect was huge. British media stopped normal shows all at once, switching to non-stop coverage as if the nation itself were holding its breath. News anchors spoke with serious gravity. Commentators struggled to read between the lines and former. Court members hinted at government shifts that might now come sooner than anyone thought. Parliament stopped its business within minutes of the announcement. Across the country, the sound of church bells started to ring, a haunting echo of moments Britain hadn't experienced since the passing of Queen Elizabeth. In towns and cities, regular citizens started gathering without planning outside royal homes. Candles flickered in the cool evening air, faces wet with tears as people stood shoulder to shoulder in stunned silence. It wasn't just about a king's health. It was about what this moment meant. The slow, undeniable turning of a history page. Reactions from around the world poured in incredibly fast. Leaders, celebrities, and regular citizens put out statements, prayers, and emotional tributes. Social media feeds were flooded with black and white photos of Charles, William and Catherine, with captions like, "A new chapter begins," and prayers for the king. It was clear that the world wasn't just reacting to news. It was mourning the end of stability as it had known it. And beneath this wave of shared emotion, insiders whispered that this was only the beginning of a series of permanent changes about to happen. Because within the palace walls, this announcement wasn't made by itself. It was the result of sleepless nights, tense meetings, and one man's private struggle with his legacy. Those who had been closest to the decision-making process described it as the moment. Everything changed when personal weakness collided with centuries-old duty. The monarchy stood at a cliff's edge, balancing the weight of tradition with time that couldn't be stopped. But to understand how this moment of huge consequence came about, we must go back to the night when whispers inside Balmoral grew into the storm that now surrounds the monarchy. It started quietly, long before the sun came up. Inside Balmoral Castle, where royal summers usually end in peace, a sudden disturbance broke out. A private phone line connected the king's medical team to London. In the middle of the night, helicopters were redirected. Aides spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Behind locked doors, something critical happened to Charles. An episode so serious that it activated palace emergency plans not used since the Queen's final days. In the darkness of the early morning hours, a sense of worry spread through the castle like an invisible current. What started as a private medical call quickly turned into a full-scale royal emergency. Those there later described the atmosphere as eerily calm on the surface, but electric underneath. The king's sudden worsening scent ripples through every level of the royal household. Balmoral's security tightened within minutes, with movements limited and clearances raised. There was no room for mistakes, no time for waiting. For those who understood what a health emergency at this level meant, every passing second mattered. Emergency teams started arriving through hidden hallways, moving with the practiced skill of people who had practiced for this moment, but hoped it would never come. Their arrival wasn't announced, and it didn't appear on any public radar. The palace wanted complete secrecy. Only a handful of top officials were told. Among them, Princess Anne and Prince William. Both were contacted right away through secure channels. Their voices reportedly steady, but heavy with the weight of what they were hearing. Camilla, however, couldn't be reached for several critical hours, adding another layer of stress to an already fragile situation. Inside Balmoral, a rarely used series of measures known inside as the Night Protocol came into effect. This set of emergency procedures had last been used during Queen Elizabeth's final decline. It was a sign not only of how serious the king's condition was, but also of the palace's determination to maintain control over every part of the unfolding situation. Senior court members gathered quietly, phones taken away to prevent leaks, while medical specialists were quietly flown in from London under the cover of night. No public statements were made. No rumors got out. Yet those inside the castle could feel history shifting beneath their feet. The emotional weight of the night was obvious. Servants whispered prayers in hallways, their voices shaking as they held rosaries or folded their hands tightly. Doctors exchanged serious, wordless looks that said more than any official update could. The atmosphere was one of frozen time, where every whisper seemed to echo louder, and every glance carried unspoken questions about what the morning would bring. As the night got darker, a divide started to take shape within the palace walls. Not an open fight, but in the silent way people responded to crisis. Some were frozen by fear, pulling back, unsure of what would follow. Others moved with quiet determination, understanding that this wasn't just a medical emergency, but a moment that could reshape the monarchy's future. As doctors worked in silence, two drastically different responses emerged in the palace. One eaten up by fear, the other by determination. While the palace entered crisis mode, Camilla disappeared behind closed doors. Sources describe her going back to her private sitting room, ignoring calls and delaying scheduled briefings. To longtime aides, it felt strangely familiar. A queen consort pulling away into isolation under unbearable pressure. But this time, her silence wasn't just personal grief. It raised a burning question. Was she getting ready for an uncertain future or preparing for her world to fall apart? In the hours following the king's sudden health crisis, the palace machine roared to life with military precision. Advisors came together, medical briefings got more intense, and security protocols got tighter. Yet, in the middle of this whirlwind of activity, Camilla's absence created an empty space that didn't go unnoticed. Senior aides knocked repeatedly on her door, their urgency growing with every unanswered call. Scheduled emergency meetings came and went without her being there. Her deliberate pulling away sent quiet waves of confusion through the hallways. People wondered, was this a sign of emotional breakdown or strategic retreat? Inside her private rooms, Camilla was reportedly pacing the floors, overcome by a storm of emotions she could no longer hide. Those closest to her later spoke of tears, broken conversations, and moments where she sat completely still, staring at unfinished letters spread across a desk. The woman who had once stood strong beside Charles during public storms now found herself faced with a more personal, more dangerous storm. For decades, she had navigated public hate and palace politics with careful planning. But this night was different. This wasn't a battle fought in the court of public opinion. It was a private struggle with power, loyalty, and survival. As aides gathered outside her door, Camilla had hushed, broken conversations with her closest confidants. Her questions were sharp, tinged with fear. What happens if Charles can't continue? Where does that leave her position, her titles, her influence? These weren't idle thoughts. They were the questions of someone who understood that in the monarchy, power never stays the same. It shifts in moments like these, often without warning. And in that shifting landscape, her place was far from guaranteed. Insiders couldn't help but draw chilling similarities to her behavior after Princess Diana's death. Back then, too, she had pulled back, avoiding the spotlight while the monarchy adjusted itself around tragedy. History seemed to be repeating itself, but this time Camilla's role was not that of someone waiting to be carefully brought in. She was now queen consort, a central pillar of the royal structure. And her silence at such a critical hour started to look less like grief and more like weakness. In the privacy of that room, she reportedly started writing a personal statement, one that was different from the palace's unified messaging. It was said to be emotional, reflective, and designed to protect her image, not necessarily to line up with the strategic communications being organized by William's growing influence. This act alone sent ripples through senior advisors who feared a split narrative could expose fault lines in the monarchy's carefully maintained image. Behind the walls, a quiet power struggle was taking shape. Camilla's hesitation and her desire to control her own message hinted at tensions that were only just starting to surface. While the world outside waited for official updates, inside the palace, the queen consort's silence had become a political statement in itself, one that revealed both her inner turmoil and the fragile balance of power within the royal household. While Camilla struggled alone, William was already stepping into a role that would change the royal power structure overnight. Before dawn, as Balmoral's lights burned through the night, William called an emergency meeting at Kensington Palace. Witnesses describe a man transformed not the prince of ceremonial duties, but a leader with purpose. He overruled hesitant advisors, gave commands with precision, and made decisions that shocked the old guard. In those tense hours, William didn't simply fill an empty space. He set the course for what was to come. A monarchy reshaped under his steady hand. While Camilla pulled back into silence, William stepped forward with remarkable clarity. He understood the weight of the moment better than anyone. The monarchy stood at a crossroads, and being indecisive would only create uncertainty. So, he took control, personally overseeing crisis communications. He ordered the palace press office to deliver a message that was calm, authoritative, and firm. The crown remains strong. The theme was clear: continuity, unity, and future stability. No cracks, no panic. This wasn't just about protecting his father's dignity. It was about preserving the institution itself. William's first move was to silence the swirl of speculation that had already started to leak through media circles. He gathered the communications team, looked closely at every line of their drafts, and reshaped them in his own words. Advisors used to carefully worded statements approved by committees found themselves watching the prince dictate tone and language with striking confidence. His emphasis on stability wasn't accidental. It was strategic. He knew that in moments of uncertainty, the public didn't look to spokespeople. They looked to the next in line, and he was determined to appear ready. Behind closed doors, William made a series of private calls to key members of the Privy Council. These conversations weren't ceremonial pleasantries. They were real, forward-looking discussions about government backup plans should the king's condition get worse. Insiders described his tone as composed but decisive. asking clear questions about transition measures should the king's condition worsen. For many, this was the first real glimpse of William as more than heir apparent. He was preparing quietly but unmistakably to take on the burden of kingship sooner than expected. In the rare breaks between calls, William reportedly thought about his mother. Those who know him well say that moments like these bring up memories of Diana's quiet conversations with him about duty, compassion, and courage. She had once told him that leadership isn't about waiting for the right time. It's about stepping up when others hesitate. In that pre-dawn silence, with the nation on edge and the palace in chaos, William lived those words. Meanwhile, Camilla's team, once used to having influence in palace business, found themselves increasingly pushed aside. Decisions that might have once required talking with multiple groups were now flowing through a single channel. William's senior staff noticed the shift right away. Some were unsettled by how easily he took control. Others were quietly relieved, sensing that someone had finally taken the reins. In whispered conversations among court members, a new phrase started to go around. Acting monarch. It wasn't official, but it reflected the undeniable reality of who was leading in this moment of crisis. This wasn't a takeover. It was a quiet revolution happening not through public announcements, but through decisive action. In a matter of hours, William had repositioned himself from the edge of palace operations to its center. And while the world still waited for formal updates on Charles's condition, the balance of power inside the royal household had already started to shift. But even as William took control, Charles himself was facing a private struggle that would change the monarchy forever. Alone in his study in the early hours, King Charles received the medical diagnosis that would shake him to his core. After years of carrying the weight of the crown, he was forced to face a truth he had avoided. His reign might be far shorter than he ever imagined. Calling Princess Anne and his most trusted aide, he made a decision based not in protocol, but in legacy, and set in motion the storm now unfolding. The news from his doctors was delivered with measured precision, but the message beneath the clinical language hit with brutal force. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather the confirmation of fears that had quietly lingered for months. Charles listened in silence, his face showing none of the turmoil raging within. This was the moment every monarch dreads, the point where duty collides with mortality. For years, he had prepared to reign, to embody the continuity of the monarchy after his mother's historic era. Yet now, in the stillness of that night, he was forced to consider that his time on the throne might be defined not by long decades of steady leadership, but by the decisions he made in these fragile, fleeting moments. As the doctors left, Charles sat alone, thinking about the long path that had brought him here. Memories flooded in with startling clarity. The pressure of his youth, the public battles over his private life, the tumultuous years after Diana's death, and finally, the long-awaited rise to the throne. But along with those memories came something heavier, a sense of unfinished purpose. His reign had barely begun, and already he was staring into the uncertain horizon of what might follow. His thoughts drifted to Diana, to her unshakable presence in the public imagination, and to the legacy she had left through William. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a realization that her shadow still shaped the future of the monarchy in ways he could no longer control. His mind turned to Camilla. For decades, she had stood beside him through scandal and public scrutiny, evolving from a figure of controversy to queen consort. But if his health failed, what would become of her place within the institution? Would the public accept her continued role? Or would the crown's machinery quietly shift around her, leaving her isolated? These weren't abstract fears. They were deeply personal ones, rooted in his understanding of how ruthless history could be when power started to shift. With those thoughts swirling, Charles called Princess Anne and his most trusted aide for a private meeting. They arrived quietly, but the atmosphere inside the study was thick with unspoken seriousness. This wasn't a routine discussion of royal schedules or ceremonial plans. What followed was a raw, deeply human confession. Charles spoke not as king, but as a brother and a man facing the limits of his time. He spoke of legacy, of his hopes for the monarchy's future, and of the need to secure stability before illness could control events for him. Anne, known for her composure, was visibly shaken as she listened. She understood better than anyone the historical weight of what he was about to do. In a decisive moment, Charles gave an order that few knew he had the power to give. He told his aide to get a sealed letter he had written in the aftermath of Diana's death, a document that had been locked away for decades in the royal archives. Its contents had been shaped during one of the most turbulent periods of his life, long before he became king, and yet he believed it held the key to securing the crown's future. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the result of years of quiet thinking, sealed away until the moment he knew he might no longer be able to steer events himself. Anne left the room with a look that those close to her would later describe as carrying the weight of the crown itself. She understood the significance of what her brother had set in motion. Charles, meanwhile, remained seated in the silence of his study. A man who had finally accepted the cost of leadership in its most personal form. He was no longer simply reacting to events. He was shaping the endgame of his reign. That letter, locked away for decades, would soon be unsealed, and it held the power to reshape the crown. For years, rumors went around about a secret letter Charles wrote in the aftermath of Diana's passing. A document never meant for public eyes. But now retrieved from royal archives, the letter has been opened. Senior court members call it a thunderclap. Its contents don't just address succession, they rewrite it. What Charles wrote in grief decades ago is now the blueprint for a monarchy on the brink of dramatic change. The letter's existence had long been the subject of whispers among palace insiders. Some dismissed it as myth, a relic of Charles's younger years, when he was still struggling to reconcile duty and personal grief. But those who knew its significance understood it held something far more powerful. Charles's private vision for the monarchy's future. Created at a time when emotions ran high and history was shifting beneath his feet. Written shortly after Diana's death, it carried a tone that was raw, unfiltered, and startlingly honest. And now, with his health failing, he had ordered it unsealed, not to stir up the past, but to secure the future. As the letter was carefully brought out from the archives, senior advisors gathered behind closed doors to read it. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The document didn't simply outline preferences. It laid out a backup plan for succession should Charles become unable to serve. In striking language, the letter emphasized William's early rise to power, positioning him not as a distant heir, but as the direct and immediate stabilizing force of the monarchy. It wasn't a vague suggestion. It was a blueprint, a decisive, emotionally charged statement that left little room for confusion. Perhaps the most shocking element was its treatment of Camilla's role, in a move that stunned even her supporters. The letter appeared to bypass her position almost entirely in the event of Charles's decline. Her status as queen consort was not reinforced, nor was she given a defined place in this hypothetical future. Instead, the language subtly but unmistakably placed the focus on William and the line of succession through him. For some advisors, this was seen as Charles's ultimate acknowledgement of public sentiment. A quiet admission that Diana's legacy and William's symbolic power were stronger anchors for the crown than his own marriage could ever be. The revelation split advisors into groups overnight. Some argued for keeping it quiet, warning that revealing the letter would throw the palace into chaos and undermine Camilla's standing. Others insisted that the letter represented Charles's true wishes and should be respected, even if it triggered shockwaves throughout the royal household. The debate grew heated with private arguments, spilling into whispered conversations in hallways and urgent late-night calls between senior figures. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As more people became aware of the letter's contents, the risk of a leak grew exponentially. In an institution built on secrecy and careful control, this document represented dynamite. Its mere existence had the power to reorder alliances, shift loyalties, and unsettle the delicate balance holding the royal household together. Court members loyal to William saw it as a turning point. Those loyal to Camilla viewed it as a betrayal. And as these tensions simmered, the palace found itself on the brink of a silent but fierce internal conflict. The letter's emergence didn't just reveal secrets. It split the royal household down the middle. As word of the letter spread through royal hallways, alliances shattered overnight. Camilla, blindsided, reportedly stormed into closed-door meetings, demanding answers. William stood, unshaken, backed quietly by Anne. What began as whispered concerns became open confrontations, echoing through centuries-old halls. This was no longer about health updates. It was a struggle for power, legacy, and the soul of the monarchy itself. The impact of the letter was immediate and intense. Camilla's reaction was explosive. Those close to her say she felt betrayed, not just by the contents of the document, but by the fact that it had been kept from her until it was too late to shape its narrative. She stormed into high-level palace meetings, demanding clarity from senior court members. Her voice, usually measured and diplomatic, was sharp with anger as she questioned why she had been pushed aside from a decision that affected her future so deeply. For a woman who had spent decades fighting to secure her place within the royal structure, this letter represented a sudden, devastating threat. William, however, was unmoved. Backed by Anne and a growing circle of senior advisors, he maintained a calm but firm stance. This was not a moment for negotiation, nor was he willing to bend to emotional appeals. Those in the room described his demeanor as controlled and authoritative. A prince, no longer waiting in the wings, but standing at the center of power. Anne's quiet presence behind him spoke volumes. Her support carried historical weight, signaling to court members that the traditional backbone of the monarchy stood with William, not Camilla. The palace itself began to break apart. Advisors who had once worked together suddenly found themselves pulled into opposing camps. The William camp, which saw the letter as a mandate for transition, and the Camilla loyalists, who viewed it as a life-or threat to her role and influence. Late-night strategy sessions turned into tense debates. Old alliances cracked. Court members who had spent years navigating palace politics found the ground shifting beneath them faster than they could adjust. The power struggle was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time. Behind closed doors, emotional confrontations unfolded. Camilla challenged senior advisors who had been aware of the letter's existence, accusing them of disloyalty. In response, some quietly suggested that the letter reflected Charles's unfiltered wishes, and that, resisting it, could backfire politically. These heated exchanges inevitably leaked to the media through indirect channels. An overheard conversation here, a whispered comment to a journalist there. Within hours, reports of deep divisions inside the palace began to appear in the press. Carefully phrased but unmistakably damaging. Outside the palace walls, the public mood was shifting rapidly. Opinion polls and social media trends began to reflect overwhelming support for William and Catherine as symbols of stability and modernity. People saw in them a future that felt certain, in contrast to Camilla's increasingly isolated stance. Members of Parliament were quietly briefed on the implications of the letter and the conversations taking place behind palace doors. Though no official announcements had been made, political circles were already preparing for the possibility of a swift government shift if Charles's health declined further. Within days, the royal household had become a battleground of competing visions. Camilla's emotional appeals clashed with William's calculated leadership. Advisors whispered in hallways. Alliances shifted like sand. And all the while, the letter loomed over every conversation like an unspoken order. What began as a private revelation had escalated into a full-blown internal split with national and global consequences. As the palace broke apart, the king himself emerged to face his people and confirm the decision that would change everything. Under the glow of the royal crest, King Charles appeared on national television. Frail, serious, yet determined. His voice trembled, but his message carried the weight of centuries. He spoke not as a distant monarch, but as a father, a son, and a man at a crossroads. Britain watched with tears in their eyes as he confirmed the decision that would change the monarchy's future. For weeks, speculation had built up. The letter's unsealing had triggered shockwaves within the palace. Groups had formed, and the public had sensed that something huge was happening behind closed doors. But no one truly understood the seriousness of the situation until Charles himself addressed the nation. This was no routine royal broadcast. It was a historic moment, one that blended personal vulnerability with the seriousness of monarchy. As he sat before the nation, his words carried both the finality of a decision already made and the weight of a legacy being carefully handed over. For the first time, Charles publicly acknowledged the truth that had been whispered in palace hallways and debated in Parliament's quiet rooms. His health was in decline. He spoke plainly, without decoration, about the challenges he was facing. There was no self-pity, only an almost stoic acceptance. "This is not the path I imagined," he said softly. "But it is the path before me." Those watching at home could feel the tension between his duty and his humanity. This was a king who had spent his life waiting for this role, only to find himself forced to face its fragility. Far sooner than expected. Then came the words that would define the speech. He confirmed that he had made an irreversible personal decision to ensure the stability and continuity of the crown. He did not use the word abdication, but the implication was unmistakable. By choosing to act while he still held authority, Charles had set in motion a deliberate and controlled transition. His phrasing was measured, but behind every line was the unmistakable understanding that the monarchy was about to enter a new era under William's leadership. The speech reached its most emotional point when Charles mentioned Diana. He spoke of her as a guiding presence, acknowledging the way her legacy lived on through William and his family. He expressed pride in William's strength and Catherine's grace, describing them as the embodiment of the future in trusted hands. For many, this was the most touching moment of father passing the symbolic torch to his son while recognizing the woman who shaped the public's perception of the monarchy in ways no institution could ever fully control. The reaction across Britain was overwhelming. Vigils began almost immediately outside royal palaces as crowds gathered with candles and flowers. Church bells rang. Television networks aired the speech on repeat, and social media flooded with messages of grief, support, and disbelief. Hashtags calling for prayers for the king trended for days, while commentators spoke of the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. It wasn't just a royal announcement. It was a national moment of collective reflection. Within the palace, attention turned to Camilla's reaction. Observers noted her quiet presence during and after the speech. There were no statements, no appearances, no outward signs of defiance or support. Her silence in the wake of the letter and the escalating internal divisions spoke louder than any public statement could. Many interpreted it as a sign that the future being shaped was one she had little control over. Charles's speech marked a turning point, not just in his reign, but in the history of the monarchy. It was the moment when centuries of tradition met the raw honesty of a frail man facing time itself. The nation wept, not just for the king's condition, but for the weight of the transition that was now inevitable. But even as the nation wept, the royal chessboard continued to shift behind the scenes. Britain stands on the edge of a new era. Charles's decision has set wheels in motion that can no longer be stopped. William's authority grows daily. Camilla's allies scramble to secure her future, and the secret letter now shapes strategies inside the palace. The monarchy is at a crossroads, and what happens in the coming days will define its next century. The reaction across the nation has been nothing short of extraordinary. In the wake of Charles's speech, public support for William and Catherine has surged to record levels. People see in them a sense of stability, continuity, and emotional connection that feels both reassuring and transformative. Crowds gather outside royal homes, not in protest, but in quiet anticipation. For many, the couple represents not just the future of the monarchy, but the promise of a new chapter, one unburdened by the complications of the past. Opinion polls, headlines, social conversations all point to a single theme. The crown's future belongs to them. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere is anything but unified. Camilla's allies, shaken by the letter's contents and the king's broadcast, are quietly plotting backup plans. Some have started floating alternative stories to sympathetic journalists, emphasizing her years of loyalty and service. Others are lobbying senior court members to ensure she keeps meaningful influence in whatever structure comes next. It's not open rebellion, but it is strategic maneuvering carried out in whispered meetings and carefully worded memos. For Camilla's circle, this is a fight for survival. The ground is shifting rapidly, and they are determined not to be swept away by the tide. Amid this brewing tension, Princess Anne has taken on an unexpected but critical role. Acting as both mediator and stabilizer, she's working behind the scenes to hold the family together. Her loyalty to Charles is unwavering, but her understanding of William's growing authority is clear-eyed. She knows the stakes better than anyone. A broken royal family could turn this moment of transition into a full-blown crisis. Anne's quiet interventions, calming tempers, making conversations happen. Urging restraint are the quiet glue holding the institution together while the storm intensifies. Beyond the palace walls, the machinery of government is already moving. Parliament has begun quietly preparing government pathways to accommodate the king's irreversible personal decision. Committees are examining historical precedents, legal frameworks, and ceremonial protocols, ensuring that if a formal transition occurs, it will unfold with precision and minimal public disruption. The urgency is obvious. Lawmakers understand that in a moment like this, any hesitation could fuel uncertainty both at home and abroad. Meanwhile, the world is watching. International media has turned the British monarchy into its leading story, picking apart every detail, speculating on every possible outcome. Foreign leaders put out carefully worded statements. Diplomats seek briefings, and global audiences follow each development with a mix of fascination and disbelief. What was once confined to whispers in royal hallways has become a worldwide political event. Its ripples felt far beyond Britain's borders. And as these forces come together, public sentiment, palace intrigue, political preparations, and international scrutiny, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. Something historic is about to happen. The letter has set the blueprint. Charles's words have framed the moment. William's actions are steering the future, and Camilla's allies are scrambling to hold their ground. Every move now carries consequence. Every conversation the potential to shape royal destiny.